listening to the Labor Notes podcast, the weekly show from Labor Notes on rank and file news and organizing tactics. I'm pod co-host Danielle Smith, organizer at Labor Notes.
And I'm pod co-host Natascha Elena Uhlmann, a staff writer at Labor Notes.
In these humid, languorous days, one surefire way to beat the summer doldrum is laid out at the People's Beach at the Rockaways, aka Jacob Riis Park, with an ice-cold house seltzer in one hand and a book about organizing in the other. If that sounds like your kind of August weekend, you're in the right place, because we have a couple of recommendations for some new labor reading you might want to toss into your beach baskets tomorrow.
One is by former Starbucks worker Jaz Brisack, who helped organize the first Starbucks location to unionize. That was at a store in Buffalo, New York, back in 2021. Brisack talks a lot about the organizing principles and strategies they followed, how they built their escalating campaign with these massive union drives, sometimes simultaneously across multiple stores, the kinds of issues they focused on to bring members together, the actions they organized, and how they developed worker leaders and a system to coordinate organizing across the country.
In the book, Get on the Job and Organize, which came out this year, Brisack also talks about salting, which is where workers take on jobs in part to help organize the workplace. Brisack was themselves a SALT, and they get into a really useful account of how they worked with so-called peppers, people in the workplace who are already eager to organize but don't quite know where to start.
And we're also going to talk about a book on corporate research that feels like a great companion to Brisack's account. That one's called What the Boss Doesn't Want Us to Know: Discovering Power and Winning Campaigns, and it's by Tom Jurovich, Olivia Gaho, and Andrew Gorey. It's basically a book-length adaptation of research techniques outlined on the website strategiccorporateresearch.org.
I got to take Tom Jurovich's class in grad school, and he has a lot of great advice on where to look for details like who finances your employer, who its key decision makers are, and where your employer makes most of its profit, which can provide a really good starting point for a campaign. And if you're like me and get scared whenever you open up a spreadsheet with dollar signs, it's a pretty good course to take. But also, and honestly more importantly, it talks about how to do those things in a way that bring you and your coworkers together and gets you ready to build that campaign mountain of escalating actions in a contract campaign.
We've got editor Jenny Brown back with us today, who has reviewed both books this month and also covered the Starbucks campaign. You can read Jenny's reviews on labornotes.org/archives. Jenny, thanks for being here.
Thanks, it's great to be back.
Let's start with the Starbucks campaign. There's been a lot of attention and coverage in the past few years on how Starbucks workers have organized like 600 stores across the US in a relatively short time. It was considered an against-the-odds organizing project, as you note in your review, considering how small and scattered a lot of the stores are, how high turnover is, and not to mention Starbucks being a powerful mega chain. How does this book speak to the trajectory of how they got from 0 to 600 stores?
Well, lots of workers face bad conditions, but because the unionization rate is so low now in the US, very few of us have experience with unions, either personally or in our families. And most unions don't really have the resources to organize small shops. Most Starbucks stores have between like 12 and 20 workers. So even if a barista did call a union for help, they might not get it. The union that did back this effort, Workers United's Rochester Regional Joint Board, did have some experience already organizing coffee shops with Gimme Coffee in Ithaca and Spot Coffee in Buffalo. But the key to sparking this campaign, as Brisack writes, was people with some union experience hiring in as salts. Brisack and their mentor, Richard Benziger, basically put this mysterious ad in unionjobs.com for Project Germinal, which was actually for salting. And they found about 10 people who then hired in at Buffalo area Starbucks with the hope of unionizing. And their idea was to raise standards in Buffalo. I think it's true of workplaces everywhere, but Starbucks is a really great example that the author goes on to detail. There were plenty of what Brisack calls peppers, baristas who were looking for a way to improve their conditions already and were ready to take action and to take risks. But it took the salts, along with some institutional union backing, to actually win elections in those first stores.
Was there anything in here that felt especially interesting in a taking you behind the curtains way, or that's been kind of under-discussed elsewhere?
Yeah, well, one thing is that the salts needed support and they needed to be able to talk to each other. So they were actually part of the Inside Organizer School, which I think is a very important element of this. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that Starbucks allowed partners, as they call them, to pick up shifts at other locations. So the salts were able to make friends and find peppers all across town. And that really helped when management became aware of the campaign and flooded the stores with higher-ups from across the country in an attempt to crush the union effort. And some of the things they did, they closed stores, they punished activists, they were breathing down everyone's necks. In one case, they temporarily closed a store, allegedly to do a deep cleaning, and everybody got down on their hands and knees with toothbrushes and did the deep cleaning. And then, while also being dragged into anti-union meetings, they even brought in new equipment, and then management closed the store permanently anyway as a way to shut down the union effort. But even in all that, one Buffalo store of the three in that first batch that filed won their election outright in December 2021. And when the news hit, it made national news, and baristas around the country started contacting them to ask how to get a union in their stores. And I thought this was interesting too. At first, it was the salts that had answered the calls, but it quickly became the newly organized workers with their really recent battle experience who were giving advice and guidance, a system that the union called Partners on Point. This meant that organizing could go much faster than if this kind of work had been taken on by staff, and it meant that everybody was learning at a great rate together. And then dozens of stores filed for elections, and then over the last 3 years, hundreds have filed for elections. But the firing started soon after that. The firing started with 7 workers in Memphis. And Brisack and Bensiger thought that at that point, the campaign should have called a boycott until the fired workers were reinstated. But it was kind of a debate, right? Do you boycott and maybe hurt the livelihood of baristas who haven't even heard of the union yet or who are thinking about organizing? So that's one of the debates that Brisack talks about. Thanks to a somewhat more worker-friendly NLRB than we have now, the Memphis 7 workers did actually get their jobs back 9 months later. But at least 100 workers have been fired by Starbucks in the course of the campaign, and perhaps many more. And the company has closed many stores to try to eradicate the union, including all 3 of the stores in Ithaca. So it's been a long, hard struggle.
You mentioned the Inside Organizer School. For those who don't know what that is, could you quickly explain it, Jenny?
Yeah, so Bensiger, Chris Townsend, and Jaz Brisack started the Inside Organizer School in 2018, and their theory was basically what we've been talking about, that while 60 million Americans say they would like a union, most have no idea how to start organizing one. And so they figured that a revival of the union tradition of salting would be necessary, and that salts would need to be recruited, trained, and supported. And so that's the goal of the school.
That's funny what you mentioned earlier about workers picking up shifts as a way to build relationships at other stores. That's something we saw in the Sugared and Bronze campaign, which we'll be covering soon. That's a beauty salon chain, which we believe is the first to win a union election in the country. And funnily enough, as management caught wind of the campaign, workers say they were suddenly blocked from picking up shifts at other stores. Do you have a sense of where things stand currently with the Starbucks campaign? It seemed like just in December they were pretty close to settling a master contract, but we haven't heard a lot since.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, over 600 stores have been organized to date, but that's still a small percentage of the 13,000 company-operated Starbucks stores in the U.S. In February of last year, when around 400 stores had been organized, the union finally was able to get the company to agree to what they called a foundational framework to negotiate a contract with all the union stores. And that involved Starbucks finally extending credit card tipping and raises to the union stores, which for years they had been illegally punishing union stores by giving the non-union stores the things that the union had raised as demands. So Starbucks Workers United really got to that point through a multi-pronged approach. It included safety strikes, short national strikes, putting up pro-union board members for election at the corporate board, a defamation lawsuit, hundreds of NLRB complaints, many of which were judged against the company. But things bogged down this year. The company has been dragging its feet, and the union has gone back to short strikes as a strategy. One problem is that the Trump administration, NLRB, is hostile to workers, and it's possible that the company is relying on that in that they think they can get away with not bargaining in good faith. So Starbucks Workers United is asking community supporters, anybody who drinks coffee, to sign a pledge to not cross a picket line when they next strike. And you can get a bunch of information about it at sbworkersunited.org. Or if you work for Starbucks and haven't got a union yet, you can get information about that too, and they can help you.
Something we might really want to take away from Brisack's book and the Starbucks campaign is how important it is to use a lot of different pressure levers to bring management to the table. And that's the very thing we get into with our second book you reviewed, Jenny, about corporate research. Again, it's called What the Boss Doesn't Want Us to Know: Discovering Power and Winning Campaigns. I have some thoughts on this one too, because I've had a chance to use some of these research techniques in campaigns I've helped to support. Basically, this book talks about corporate research, how you should do it, why you need it, and some nuts and bolts advice on how to do it. Jenny, what are your main takeaways on how they answer those questions?
Yeah, so lots of unions, though unfortunately not all, do corporate research either for organizing campaigns or for contract campaigns. But often it looks like the union staff researching and developing a plan and the workers just kind of getting marching orders after that. So the authors say that this is all backwards, and based on their extensive experience, they lay out a plan for workers to be in on the ground floor of researching their employer just from the first. One big argument for this, obviously, is that workers know the most about their workplaces, suppliers, deliveries, customers, work processes, and all kinds of useful scuttlebutt. But also, it's really great to learn more about how your employer operates, like pulling back the curtain on Oz, one union leader that they quote said. So the idea is you need someone organizing this, either staff, a researcher, or an active and knowledgeable member. But you want to get 8 to 10 workers together, preferably from different departments and shifts, to commit to a 6-week research project with weekly meetings and a timeline. And the book and the accompanying website, strategiccorporateresearch.org, lists 24 key questions for the researchers to answer, including about the finances of the firm. And some of this is rather complicated. But the authors believe, based on consulting on many campaigns and doing these teams of researchers, that it's really worth working through it with a group of workers and teaching the skills to do this. They suggest starting with stuff that the workers know from experience and filling those into a Google Doc. It gives people a boost of confidence before tackling the harder questions, which, might mean delving into spreadsheets and financial reports. But during COVID, the authors found that Zoom calls and shared Google Docs really helped everyone participate and develop the information together. And then by the 6th week, it's time to come up with a strategy based on what you learned, thinking about how to involve coworkers and escalate it.
So what's the value of having something like a timed 6-week program that this book outlines to work on this kind of research?
6 weeks seems like a really compressed timeline, but they say that people start to drift off if it's more than 6 weeks, and I can totally understand that. I mean, the goal is to make it doable for people who are also working long hours, and to make it collective through Zoom and shared Google Docs or a similar system to lower the barriers to participation.
Danielle, I also want to hear about how you use this kind of research in the campaigns you worked on when you were with the News Guild, and how you think it relates to the Campaign Mountain, which longtime pod listeners will know Danielle and our coworker Lisa run a labor notes course on.
Yeah, well, one thing Jenny mentions in her review is that some research is better than none at all. And transparently, I think I found myself more often in the some research boat. And, I was a member of the News Guild of New York for a while, and then I went on to become a staff organizer. And it was great working with journalists because I feel like I would often just find myself kind of turning the research over to them. And I also think the advice about doing it at the beginning of the campaign is really crucial because that really allows you to think about how you want to lay things out over time. But I often found myself kind of getting into this a little bit towards the end of the campaigns. And I remember once having a group about to go out on strike, and we had a strategic research committee that I was ostensibly guiding, but I was pulled in a million directions, so I just asked a couple of strong members on the committee if they wanted to run it and handed them the reins. And they did a really good job and, found all sorts of, pieces of information we were able to use, but probably not the ideal way to do things versus, the way it's laid out in the book. But as Jenny said, it really was true that having some research was definitely better than having none at all. And when it comes to the campaign mountain, I think this is where having members involved in the research really makes a difference. In our contract campaign workshop, we talk about how important it is to have an open communication and feedback loop with members when moving up the campaign mountain, which is this visual we use to demonstrate how we can plan escalating actions over time to win our demands. So when members were involved in the research, it was easier for them to be part of the decision making of, oh, we need to go fire this corporation, or we need to do an action in front of this decision maker's house. It gave them more ownership over the strategy rather than someone from the top just saying, well, you guys need to go do this now. And, it's kind of like, well, why? In the book, they talk about some specific campaigns that applied these research techniques, including some at the News Guild, though not, the campaigns I worked on. Jenny, I was wondering if there were examples or case studies that stood out to you.
Well, the authors give a sort of a negative example from the early 1990s, which was the Work to Rule campaign and lockout at the Staley corn processing plant in Decatur, Illinois. They say this is an example of what not to do, in that they say the campaign only focused on the plant itself or stopping production in the plant or keeping scabs out and so on. I would kind of disagree on two counts here. One, the most concentrated power workers have is at the point of production. So while it's usually not enough to do a work to rule or even a strike, that is a vital element. On top of that, workplace activities are where we most understand our collective power, whether that's a march on the boss, everybody wearing a button, whatever it is, that's where we understand it. The authors acknowledge that strategic corporate campaigns have the danger of becoming staff-driven and far from the workplace and the workforce. And so I do think that that's a problem that we need to pay attention to. But often we're going up against big companies with deep pockets and an incentive to crush our unions. So the authors argue that you need to come at the company from several angles, exploring every weakness, and most importantly, track the way power flows through the company. Who are the decision makers? Where does the money come from? What are the profit centers? And so on. But that brings me to a second disagreement. This is, in fact, exactly what the Staley workers did in the early 90s. In addition to calling in the legendary Jerry Tucker of the UAW to coach them in their 9-month Work to Rule campaign, they also voted to increase their dues to bring in labor educators and to pay corporate campaigner Ray Rogers to design a campaign that actually managed to get 2 board members to resign their posts in other places. It targeted investors like State Farm Insurance and customers like Miller and Pepsi. And after a hard-fought campaign, Miller stopped buying from Staley, which was like 10% of their customer base. And in fact, there was a big debate about whether to primarily target investors or customers, which really shows just how hard these decisions can be. You don't have unlimited time or funds, and choices have to be made. The Staley story is actually told in this excellent 2009 book, Staley, Staley, by Steve Ashby and C.J. Hawking. And I recommend that actually as a companion to learning about corporate campaigns. It's a really gripping story of how a kind of sleepy industrial union, which is suddenly faced with a ruthless multinational, Tate & Lyle, which bought their plant, they were able to educate themselves and build themselves up to wage a historic, really nationally known labor fight on a scale which seems astounding today. And the fact that they ultimately lost doesn't mean we can't learn from the excellent things they did. And that brings me to something that the authors don't explicitly mention in the book, but which I think is important, and that's that doing research on your employer can also be a kind of a crash course in how capitalism works. And that's valuable in itself. I mean, even if the immediate battle is lost, the war on workers, we can be sure, will continue. And we need as many workers armed with the understanding for that as possible in order to ultimately win that war.
Thank you, Jenny. It is so true that learning how our employer functions can be radicalizing. And that's our episode. Rate us or leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. If you're listening to us on Podbean at labornotespodcast.podbean.com, download our episode.
And if you want to talk more about organizing tips with other workers, join our next Secrets of a Successful Organizer training, a 3-part online series we do once every few months. We're doing this one next on Mondays, September 8th, 15th, and 22nd, from 7:30 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 to 6:30 p.m. Pacific. You can sign up on labornotes.org/events.
The Labor Notes podcast is produced by Danielle Smith, Sindhu Sundar, and myself. Our title music was written and performed by our coworker, Keith Brower Brown. See you next week. Solidarity, y'all.